The whispers started the moment Emma walked into the general store that morning, her worn boots clicking against the wooden floorboards. She felt their eyes on her back, heard the rustle of skirts as the women leaned together, their voices dropping to that particular pitch reserved for scandal and judgment. "Marrying him," one woman said, loud enough to be heard, "a poor widower with 3 little girls. What is she thinking? Desperate, I suppose." Another replied. At 32, her options were running thin. Emma's fingers tightened around the handle of her basket, but she kept her chin up, continuing down the aisle as if she hadn't heard a word. She'd grown used to the gossip in the 6 months since she'd married Thomas Gardner, though it still stung like nettles against bare skin. Thomas was a quiet man, weathered by life and loss. His wife had died 3 years prior, leaving him with 3 daughters, Mary, age 10, Sarah, age 7, and little Grace, barely 5 years old. He worked odd jobs around town, fixing fences, mending roofs, doing whatever he could to put food on the table. They lived in a small, dilapidated cottage on the edge of town, and everyone knew he could barely afford the rent. When Thomas had proposed to Emma, kneeling in the garden where she worked as a hired hand for the wealthy Thornton family, she hadn't hesitated. She'd seen the kindness in his eyes, the gentle way he spoke of his daughters, the calluses on his hands that told of honest work. She'd been alone since her parents died, working for wages that barely kept her fed, and she'd long ago given up on the girlish dreams of romance that her peers had chased in their youth. But she hadn't married him out of desperation, despite what the town believed. She'd married him because when he looked at her, she felt seen. And when she'd met his daughters, their eyes hungry for a mother's love, something in her heart had cracked open. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Patterson's voice carried clearly now. "They're being evicted. The landlord finally lost patience. Where will they go with no money and 4 mouths to feed?" Emma's heart sank. Thomas had tried to hide the notice from her, but she'd found it tucked in his coat pocket the night before. They had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. She completed her purchases quickly, ignoring the pitying glances and knowing smiles, and hurried home. Home, the word still felt new, even after 6 months. The cottage might be falling apart, the roof might leak when it rained, but it was filled with laughter and love in a way she'd never experienced before. When she arrived, she found Thomas in the small yard, his face troubled, staring at something in his hands. The girls were at school, their absence making the space feel emptier than usual. Emma set down her basket and approached him. He looked up, and she saw tears in his eyes, something she'd never witnessed before. In his hands was an old, yellowed letter, the paper soft with age. "I should have done this years ago," he said, his voice rough, "but I was afraid of what I'd find, afraid of false hope." Emma sat beside him on the rickety bench. "What is it?" "A letter from my father. He gave it to me before he died, when Catherine was still alive and we were happy. He told me not to open it unless things became truly desperate." Thomas laughed, a bitter sound. "I suppose being evicted qualifies." He handed her the letter, and Emma read it slowly, her eyes widening with each line. Thomas's father had owned land, a significant parcel, hidden in a valley 3 days' journey from town. He'd kept it secret, paying the taxes through a lawyer, telling no one of its existence. The letter contained a deed, coordinates, and a simple explanation. The land had been his refuge, his secret, and now it belonged to Thomas. There was a cabin there, built by his father's own hands, and a valley so rich and fertile that anything planted there seemed to thrive. "Why did he keep it secret?" Emma whispered. "My father was a complicated man. He had debts in his youth, people who would have taken everything from him. So he bought this land under a different name, built his cabin, and never told a soul. He wanted me to have something that no one could take away, but only when I truly needed it." Emma looked at her husband, seeing the war in his eyes, hope battling with disbelief, fear wrestling with possibility. "We should go," she said firmly. "We should see it. It could be nothing. The cabin could have fallen into ruin. The land could be worthless. Or it could be everything." Emma took his hands in hers. "Thomas, we have nothing to lose. We're being evicted anyway. Let's take the girls and go see what your father left you." The journey took 4 days, not 3, because they had to move slowly with the children and their few possessions packed into a borrowed wagon. The townspeople watched them leave with knowing looks and shaking heads, running away from their debts. Someone muttered, "Those poor girls," another sighed, "dragged into the wilderness by foolish parents." But the girls themselves were excited, treating it as an adventure. Mary helped Emma pack food for the journey. Sarah collected wildflowers along the road and pressed them into a book. Little Grace sang songs, her voice sweet and clear in the morning air. Thomas navigated using his father's detailed directions, and Emma watched the landscape change around them. They left behind the settled farmland near town, traveled through thick forests, and climbed into hills that seemed to touch the sky. Just when Emma thought they must be lost, when the path seemed to disappear entirely, they crested a final ridge. And there it was. The valley spread before them like something from a dream. A river wound through its center, glittering in the afternoon sun. The land was covered in wild grass, dotted with trees, surrounded by protective hills, and there, near the river's edge, stood a cabin. It wasn't the ramshackle structure Emma had feared. Though weathered by years and seasons, the cabin was solid, built of good timber with careful hands. It was larger than their cottage in town, with a wide porch and a stone chimney. Around it, she could see the remnants of a garden gone wild, fruit trees that had survived untended, and a barn that still stood straight and true. "Papa," Mary breathed, clutching her father's arm, "is this ours?" Thomas couldn't speak. He simply nodded, tears streaming freely down his face now. They spent that first night in amazement, exploring their new home. The cabin's interior had been protected from the elements Thomas's father had built well. There were 2 bedrooms, a large main room with a fireplace, and even a small loft where the girls could sleep. Furniture remained, simple but sturdy, covered in dust but intact. The next days were a blur of activity. They cleaned the cabin until it shone, repaired what needed fixing, and began to explore the land. The garden soil was rich and dark, and the river provided fresh water and fish. Thomas found his father's tools in the barn, well-made implements that had been carefully stored. But the true revelation came when they explored the valley more thoroughly. At the far end, tucked against the hillside, they discovered why Thomas's father had chosen this place and kept it so secret. A silver vein ran through the rocks, visible even to Emma's untrained eye. Thomas stood before it for a long time, then sat down heavily on a boulder. He was mining it, he said quietly, gesturing to the subtle signs of excavation, carefully concealed. "Not extensively, just enough to pay the taxes and save money for me. That's why he could afford this land, why he kept it hidden." "What do we do?" Emma asked. Thomas looked at his daughters, playing by the river, their laughter echoing off the valley walls. He looked at his wife, her face bright with possibility. He looked at the cabin, solid and waiting, and the land stretching green and fertile in every direction. "We live," he said. "We farm this land, we raise our girls, and if we need to, we mine enough silver to get by, but carefully, quietly. This isn't about becoming rich, Emma. This is about being free." And so they did. They planted crops in the fertile soil and were astonished by the abundance. The isolation that might have seemed lonely felt like peace. The girls thrived, growing strong and happy, their cheeks taking on color, their eyes bright with security and love. Thomas would occasionally take a small amount of silver to the town, selling it through a trader who asked no questions. It was enough to buy what they couldn't make or grow themselves, enough to put away savings for the girls' futures. 2 years passed before anyone from their old town saw them again. It was Mary who insisted on returning. At 12, she wanted to see her old friends, to show them the pressed flowers she'd collected and the books she'd been reading. Emma was reluctant, remembering the gossip and judgment, but Thomas agreed that hiding away forever wasn't the answer. They took the wagon into town on a bright autumn morning, the girls dressed in new clothes Emma had sewn, their faces healthy and glowing. The wagon itself was new too, sturdy and well made, purchased with silver money. The reception was immediate and unmistakable. Heads turned, conversations stopped. Mrs. Patterson actually dropped her basket, vegetables rolling across the street. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop outside the general store, and Emma noticed the way people stared at her daughters. No longer the thin, worried children they'd been, but happy and healthy and confident. Thomas Gardner, the storekeeper, stepped out, his eyes wide. "Is that really you?" "It is, Mr. Brennan. We've come to do some shopping and perhaps visit old friends." The storekeeper looked at the wagon, the horses, the family's evident well-being. "I heard you'd left town, heard you were running from debts." "No debts," Thomas said calmly. "We went to claim land my father left me." The news spread through town like wildfire. By the time they left the general store, a crowd had gathered. Emma saw the same women who'd gossiped about her. Their expressions now complicated mixtures of curiosity, envy, and embarrassment. Mrs. Patterson approached, her voice syrupy sweet. "My dear, you look so well. We'd heard well, we'd worried about you all, leaving so suddenly." Emma met her eyes steadily. "How kind of you to worry. As you can see, we're doing quite well." "That valley you spoke of." Another woman interjected, unable to contain her curiosity. "What is it like?" Thomas stepped forward, his arm around Emma's waist. "It's our home. It's private, peaceful, and provides everything we need. My father spent years preparing it for us, and we're grateful every day." "But surely," someone else said, "you'll be coming back to town now. With resources, you could. We're happy where we are." Emma interrupted gently but firmly. "We came today so the girls could visit friends and to purchase supplies. But the valley is our home now." Little Grace tugged on Emma's skirt. "Mama, can we go home soon? I miss the river." The word "mama" caused a ripple through the crowd. Emma smiled down at Grace, smoothing her hair. "Soon, sweetheart." They completed their business and prepared to leave. As Thomas helped Emma onto the wagon, the mayor approached, a speculative look in his eyes. "Mr. Gardner, if you've discovered valuable land, perhaps we could discuss." "There's nothing to discuss," Thomas said pleasantly but firmly. "The land is ours, properly deeded and paid for. We wish everyone well, but we prefer our privacy." As they drove out of town, Emma looked back once. She saw the faces of the people who'd pitied her, mocked her, assumed she'd made a desperate choice. She saw Mrs. Patterson's pinched expression, the mayor's frustrated frown, the naked envy in some eyes. But mostly, she saw the smallness of it all, the petty judgments, the narrow thinking, the inability to see value in anything but social standing and immediate wealth. "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked quietly as the town disappeared behind them, leaving society, living so remotely. Emma looked at her husband, this good man who'd offered her not wealth or status but partnership and love. She looked at her daughters, for they were truly hers now, laughing together in the back of the wagon. She thought of the valley waiting for them, the cabin that was more home than anywhere she'd ever lived, the freedom to build a life on their own terms. Not for a moment, she said. The girls fell asleep on the journey home, exhausted by the excitement. As the wagon climbed the final ridge and the valley came into view, Emma felt the tension she'd been carrying release from her shoulders. "Will they come looking?" she asked, "for the silver?" Thomas shook his head. "They don't know about it, and I intend to keep it that way. As far as they know, we're just successful farmers in a fortunate location. My father taught me that the greatest wealth is what no one knows you have." They reached the cabin as the sun set, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Thomas carried Grace inside while Emma helped Mary and Sarah, and together they tucked the girls into their beds. Later, standing on the porch with Thomas, Emma looked out at their land, their hidden valley, their secret abundance, their hard-won peace. In town, people would be talking about them, speculating, perhaps even envying them. But here, in this place that the world had forgotten, they had everything that mattered. "If we were afraid enough," Emma said softly. Thomas pulled her close. He used to say that most people spend their lives chasing shadows while standing in the sun. I didn't understand what he meant until now. Inside, they could hear Grace murmuring in her sleep, Sarah's gentle snoring, Mary's occasional sleepy movements. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the river sang its eternal song beyond the cabin walls. Emma thought of the woman she'd been 2 years ago, lonely, working for wages, accepting pity and judgment as her lot in life. She thought of the moment Thomas had knelt in that garden, offering her not rescue but partnership, not wealth but honesty, not ease but love. The town had mocked her for marrying a poor widower with 3 daughters. They'd pitied her foolishness, gossiped about her desperation, and predicted her misery. And perhaps, in their narrow understanding of value and success, they'd been right to doubt. But they didn't know about the valley. They didn't know about the silver waiting patiently in the hillside, or the soil that yielded abundance, or the river that never ran dry. They didn't know about the cabin built with a father's love and foresight, or the space to breathe and grow without judgment, or the freedom that came from stepping away from their expectations. Most of all, they didn't know about the wealth that couldn't be measured in silver or land, the love of a good man, the trust of 3 beautiful girls, the satisfaction of building something real and lasting, the peace of living authentically without concern for gossip or status. As the stars emerged above the valley, Emma smiled. Let them talk in town, let them speculate and wonder and envy. Here, in this hidden place, she had everything she'd never known to dream of. And that was worth more than all the silver in the hills. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.